Today we're going to be talking about Ozzy Osbourne. Ozzy Osbourne died this week. He passed away this week. He was a great rock legend, and today's live was supposed to be about Mick Jagger because his birthday is tomorrow, but because Ozzy Osbourne passed away, it's a good excuse to talk about this very remarkable musician. Ozzy Osbourne is both iconic and controversial. His career is very interesting, and also to learn about how he impacted the music industry with the creation. He's given the name of the godfather of heavy metal. So even if you're not a fan of heavy metal, which I have to be honest to you guys, I am not a fan of heavy metal. I don't listen to heavy metal very often, but there are many songs that Ozzy Osbourne recorded which aren't in that category. I wouldn't put it as a heavy metal song. So Ozzy Osbourne has the talent, I think, of managing to attract fans even if they aren't heavy metal fans. And I'm sure there are lots of Ozzy fans here today. And even if you don't know much about Ozzy, now is your chance to practice your listening skills with me for the next 20 minutes. So it's great to see you all here. Let's start by talking about the fact that Ozzy was not born. His name was not Ozzy. His parents did not say, I'm going to give you the name Ozzy. His real name is John Michael Osbourne. And when he was at school, primary school, he was nicknamed. When we are nicknamed, we are given a name. For example, my nickname was Rach at school because my name is Rachel. Most of the time in England, nicknames are shortened versions of our names, different from Brazil, where there are a lot of nicknames which are completely different from somebody's name. But anyway, so Ozzy got his nickname, Ozzy, when he was at primary school because of his surname. His last name is obviously Osbourne, so Ozzy from the word Osbourne. And Ozzy Osbourne, or John, as he was baptized, as he was born in 1948. And this is quite a good moment for us to remember because he will have grown up in post-war Britain. So post-war, the war ended in 1945. Ozzy was born in 1948 in a city in England called Birmingham. Birmingham is in the middle of England. I'm going to show you here on the map. Oh, where is my picture of my map? Here we go. So here we have Birmingham. And Birmingham, we call it the Midlands. And Birmingham is a very much an industrial city. It was very famous for being industrial, for being a city which had factories, where industry was focused. Ever since, really, the Industrial Revolution, Birmingham has become famous for industry. Until this day, it is an industrial city. And Ozzy Osbourne was born in post-war industrial Birmingham. And he was born into a very poor neighborhood and situation. His parents both worked in factories. His father was a tool maker and his father was a tool maker and his mother worked in a factory, in a car factory. And he had 5 brothers and sisters. They lived in a 2-bedroom house in Birmingham. And they definitely grew up in poverty because post-war Britain was a very difficult place to grow up in. We obviously had ended the war with Nazi Germany, etc. But the aftermath is the moment after something. The aftermath of the event of the war was still being felt for many years. My mother was born in 1952. She won't mind me telling you that. She was born in post-war Britain, so she grew up with the effects of the war still. And so Ozzy Osbourne grew up in post-war Britain in Birmingham, and he was very much bullied at school. He had clear dyslexia at school. He did show promise in the area of performing arts and things at school. He liked to do the kind of school shows and things, but he is definitely not academic in that way. He left school at an early age. He left school at 15 years old, and he started to do lots of different jobs. He would work as an apprentice as a plumber. He worked in the factory that his mother worked in, and with that money, he would buy a microphone and an amplifier, like a speaker, which he would, put the microphone on into the speaker and be able to sing. So he had this dream of becoming a singer, this dream of becoming a performer. And he said in an interview that this was something that started when he listened, when he heard the song She Loves You by the Beatles on the radio. He said that when he heard that song by the Beatles, he decided that he too wanted to become a rock star. He too wanted to become a famous musician. He said, I wanted to be a Beatle. And that inspired him to go out, buy his microphone, buy his amplifier, and he advertised as a singer, even though he didn't really have any experience, which I think is a good lesson for us all, to try something, even if we're not the best at it, because through trying, we will find success perhaps. So he did that. And eventually he would create his first band with other members called Rare Breed in 1967. It didn't last very long, but then he would join forces with a few of the band members and they would become Earth, a band called Earth, like planet Earth, which eventually would become Black Sabbath. So we've seen this journey now into music. And we have to remember that Ozzy came from a very poor background. He didn't have musicians in his family. He didn't have the money in his family to become a musician. So he obviously had to work hard to be able to be in the position of being in a band, etc. And so he was in this band, Earth, and they were a blues rock band. This is important because lots of people think that Ozzy started music as a heavy metal artist. No, Ozzy started out as a blues rock band in the original Earth band. And it was when they watched a movie called Black Sabbath, a horror movie. So this was in the 60s and the early 70s. This was the moment when horror films were starting to become very popular. And Ozzy and his band members watched a film in 1963, which was called Black Sabbath. So it was a horror film. And he saw how popular the horror films became and said, let's change our name to Black Sabbath and let's make dark, scary music. And that's what he started to do. So they completely changed the way they were making music. They were making blues rock music. And this was the time in the 60s when who's famous in the 60s? We're talking about the Beatles. We're talking about pop music and, the start of the psychedelic movement. So it was not very common to listen to kind of dark, scary rock music that Ozzy and his band decided to start creating. Quite a risk to start making this dark music in the 60s and quite, kind of controversial. But it was a good choice to make because it made him and his band, Black Sabbath, become iconic because it was different. It was something raw, something eerie, something completely different on the radio. And the different type of music that they had created started to make them stand out from other artists and other music at that time. They were then signed to Vertigo. They would debut their first album in 1970 called Black Sabbath. At the beginning, the critics hated Black Sabbath because if you've ever listened to Black Sabbath's music, it's the type of music that you can understand that some people will really like and then some people won't like. And it's a bit like pop music. There are people who like pop music. There are people that don't like pop music. And Black Sabbath definitely created this kind of either I like it or I don't like it. And some of the critics didn't like Black Sabbath's music at the beginning. But eventually, with their second album, principally, with the album Paranoid, which had very many very famous songs on it, it would be that album that they became international stars. And that was the moment when Black Sabbath really took off, to take off. And what is interesting, this is also the moment when we see what was also happening with rock stars and many pop stars at that time. Unfortunately, drugs and alcohol. We've seen this in many of my lives where I've spoken about musicians that were famous in this period of music. And unfortunately, it's the same thing that happened. Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath members became very much involved in that scene too of drugs and alcohol, principally cocaine. And it kind of started to have a very negative effect on their capacity to perform, their capacity to record, their capacity to sing, Ozzy's capacity to sing. And they would release other albums. They would release at least another 4-5 albums. But eventually this addiction, principally Ozzy's addiction, would mean that they would end up firing Ozzy. So did you know that Ozzy was fired from Black Sabbath? So in 1979, the other band members decided to fire Ozzy. To fire means to tell him he needs to leave the band. You will leave the band. You can fire someone from their job if you are their boss. So they would fire Ozzy, and Ozzy would then become even more involved in drugs and alcohol because he had lost his job, he had lost his profession, he'd lost his love of music because he was so much involved in drugs and alcohol. And this is the moment when we see a woman that would become very much as famous as well when we talk about her later on in their marriage. He would have contact with Sharon. Sharon, as you know, was his second wife, and Sharon Osbourne met Ozzy and started to have contact with Ozzy because her father was the manager of Black Sabbath. So Sharon Osbourne's father was the manager of Black Sabbath, and she started to help Ozzy after he was fired from the band. She saw potential in Ozzy. She said, no, you could be a solo artist. And at the beginning, Ozzy obviously didn't believe in himself. He was very much still involved and heavily involved in drugs and alcohol. But Sharon insisted that he could be a solo artist. And it was quite difficult at the time for band members, even if they had very famous singers, such as Ozzy, to become solo artists. It's even quite difficult nowadays to find people who have left a very famous band and been able to become as famous or even more famous. And we can say that of perhaps Paul McCartney. We can say that of Ozzy Osbourne, because Ozzy Osbourne would become a solo artist and he would become an incredible solo artist. His albums that he created as a solo artist were incredible, and he was able to do that. He said, I would be dead if it wasn't for Sharon, because he had been in this kind of spiral of depression and drugs and alcohol because of leaving Black Sabbath. And his wife, Sharon, who wasn't married to her at the time, really said to him, no, you can do this. You can be a solo artist. And he would eventually marry Sharon in 1982. I've just realized that I haven't shared any pictures of you for you guys. Let's have a look here. So here we have Sharon marrying Ozzy Osbourne. A little bit different from the pictures we see of him on stage. And here we have him in Black Sabbath. Love the hair, guys. I think the hairstyles of the band members in this time of these bands were just incredible. So here we have Black Sabbath, the 4 members of Black Sabbath, incredible band. And then we have Ozzy here as perhaps what we know him as, kind of the scary man on stage performing. And I think what is remarkable that when he started to become a solo artist, people thought that he wouldn't be as successful as Black Sabbath. But he was incredibly successful as a solo artist. He managed to do something which a small amount, I almost said Portuguese, I said something in Portuguese, few people can do, which is reinvent himself. And he did reinvent himself, and he made his comeback. The Blizzard of Oz was a massive hit. Crazy Train, if you are a fan of Ozzy, you will know, was one of his most iconic rock songs in history. And 1989, during the 80s, he continued to record and be able to have new albums, but there was still something that was making Ozzy's life difficult, and that was drug and alcohol addiction. It wasn't something that he managed to overcome easily. He spent decades with the problem of his addiction, and he was a very controversial figure because of that, because people saw him, his dark, scary music, and this use of drug and alcohol addiction. Parents didn't really like children listening to Ozzy's music because they saw it as something that was negative, a negative impact. But actually, a lot of Ozzy's songs, if you study the lyrics of Ozzy's songs, they are not as dark as you think they are. They are not as occult as people think they are. He isn't selling Satan to people, but a lot of people associated it because of the way he was, because of the way he performed. I mean, I am pretty sure, even if you're not an Ozzy fan, you have seen or heard about an incident where he bit the head of a bat. A bat is a dark, black animal that flies at night, a little bit like Batman. So he was on stage in Iowa, and somebody threw a bat on stage, and he thought it was a rubber, a pretend, a toy, and he bit the bat, but it was actually a real bat. And so this became one of the most iconic rock incidents on stage in all of history. I mean, I remember growing up hearing about Ozzy Osbourne, the Bat Man who bit the bat. And this idea, I mean, of him actually doing that because he was kind of a rock star and everything, made parents even more want people not to listen to his music. But it's interesting how he had this kind of controversial side to his music too. And it's something that I think was completely changed when he had his reality show. So when I grew up, I knew Ozzy as this guy here. This was the Ozzy Osbourne I knew when I was growing up, because this was the person who was on TV. Ozzy Osbourne and his family were some of his family, because he was married twice. In his second marriage, he had 2 children. And so we have here Kelly and Jack. And Kelly and Jack were his children with Sharon. And they had a show on the channel MTV. And Pedro is saying here, yeah. So the Osbournes. Do you guys remember the Osbournes? I remember it being on TV when I was younger. And this was the program that younger people became more familiar with Ozzy Osbourne because of it. And they became huge celebrities all over the world because people were watching this reality TV show. And now we are very used to reality TV shows. But in that time, in the 2000s, it wasn't as common to have reality TV shows. So it was this kind of new way of showing somebody's life. And that's when Ozzy became known as not the kind of scary, dark performer, but actually a kind of funny dad, rock dad, going around his house with his dogs, talking to his children, maybe a little bit crazy sometimes. And that's when people saw another side to Ozzy Osbourne. And that's the Ozzy that I knew growing up, because obviously I wasn't alive when he was in his Black Sabbath and his initial solo career, etc. But he became very, very famous because of the Osbournes, and his children too became celebrities. And obviously we got to see Sharon more too. And Sharon became a celebrity in her own right. He also created with Sharon something called the Ozfest. The Ozfest was like a heavy metal music festival, and it helped boost and launch many different bands such as Linkin Park and Slipknot, etc., that were bands in this kind of category that Ozzy had almost created with his music. Ozzy Osbourne also became very famous in the 90s because of his big hits, such as one of my favorite songs by Ozzy, such as Mama, I'm Coming Home, which has been played a lot recently this week because of his death. In 1989, there was also a very controversial moment when Ozzy was accused of trying to strangle his wife, Sharon. Strangle is when you do this, and he was under the effects of drugs still at that time of his life, and he was arrested. He had to go to rehab, and I think he said it was the lowest moment of his whole life. I also mentioned, you guys, that Sharon was his second wife. Many people do not know that Ozzy was married before he was married to Sharon. This is his first wife, and his 3 children from his first marriage that did not take part in the reality TV show, but they are obviously his children too. So these are his 3 children from his first marriage to somebody called Thelma, who I didn't know existed, because obviously they choose not to be in the limelight. When we say somebody is in the limelight, we are saying that they are in the kind of the light of the media. Like when you're on stage and you have a light on you. So if you say someone is in the limelight, they are in the media, they are being talked about. Have I been to Birmingham, Pedro? Yes, I have been to Birmingham. When I was working in London, I used to go to Birmingham because I was working in political research, and so I've been to Birmingham quite a lot. I'm going to talk a little bit about Birmingham in a minute. But before that, I want to just mention that alongside his addiction, Ozzy Osbourne was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, which was one of the reasons why he passed away this week. He was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 2003, but we didn't know really that he had Parkinson's publicly until 2020. So when you watch the Osbournes, if you watch old episodes of the reality TV show, you can see moments when Ozzy is finding it difficult to pick things up or even say some things. And many people thought it was just the effects of having been an addict, but actually it was the initial stages of his Parkinson's disease. And if you don't know the effects of Parkinson's disease, it basically affects your balance, it gives you tremors, it affects your speech. And this obviously affected Ozzy as a performer. But even though he had Parkinson's disease, he remained an active performer. He liked to record music. He had a very famous album called Ordinary Man in 2020. And then in 2022, he also had another album called Patient Number 9, which became the best rock album of the year, voted in the Grammys. So up until 2 years ago, he was creating albums. I think it was last month or a couple of weeks ago, I think, he was performing in Birmingham, the city where he was born. And this is a remarkable moment to see him. And he was performing, sat down. Here we have him in his last show. He was sitting down. He was unable to stand to perform, but he performed anyway. And it was called, obviously, The Last Show, as Solange said here. And it was a remarkable moment that he was able to do that so shortly before he died. It was a moment for him to say goodbye on stage to all of his fans, to all of those people who had listened, enjoyed his music, etc., for them to thank him too before he passed away. So I'm sure there are a lot of fans out there who were able to go to this concert and now feel privileged that they were there when Ozzy was doing his last live performance, his last public performance too. So he is definitely remembered as a pioneer of heavy metal. He reinvented himself as a solo artist, something that's very difficult to do. He is one of the first rock celebrities to become a celebrity, to become a reality star. He battles addiction. He's a symbol of resilience, and he has become very famous for his honesty, his humor. He has very much what we call, I would say, is very much British humor. British people, we are very good at being kind of making fun of ourselves. We like to say things, that's because I'm stupid. We will say things that are bad about ourselves to make a joke. So we're very good at making fun of ourselves. It's a type of British humor, and Ozzy was very good at it. He was always making fun of himself in the interviews, etc. And during those interviews, you'll notice that he speaks with a Brummie accent. He is from Birmingham. If you are from Birmingham, you have a Brummie accent, like the Peaky Blinders, if you've watched the Peaky Blinders. So originally, this accent was associated with the industrial working class because it was in the Midlands where the factories were, etc. Nowadays, it doesn't have so much of those connotations, but it's still associated with that region. And it's very distinct, the Brummie accent. If you've tried to watch the Peaky Blinders, or if you've listened to Ozzy Osbourne in his interviews, some people think it's as difficult as Adele's accent. I don't think it is as difficult, but I know that the Brummie accent is difficult when you first start listening to it. There is a lot of flat vowels, hard consonants in the Brummie accent. It's something you need to practice listening to. And after today's live, I'm going to put an interview that Ozzy gave in my stories so you can listen to that Brummie accent and see the difference between my accent and his accent. And this accent has become almost like a characteristic of Ozzy Osbourne as well, because he's one of the most famous people to come from Birmingham. People who are from Birmingham are very proud that Ozzy Osbourne was born there, and his legacy and the fact that his last show was in Birmingham shows that. And I think that Ozzy managed to overcome a lot of things during his life. He came from, as I said, a very poor background. He struggled with addiction, and he managed to show that you can overcome those difficulties. And Ozzy was sober and had managed to fight his addiction. And he said in recent interviews, the reason why I'm alive is because I stopped drinking, I stopped taking drugs, and because Sharon helped me. And I think that's remarkable that he managed to do that. Principally because we know of many artists from that time that unfortunately couldn't overcome their drug and alcohol addiction, and unfortunately they ended up dying. We know many famous artists that ended up dying from drug and alcohol addiction. So it was lovely to speak to you guys today about Ozzy Osbourne. I have a couple of messages at the end of this lunchtime listening. I will be doing lunchtime listening until the end of the year. And so if you are interested, every Friday I will be here. This series will finish at the end of the year. There will be a new project starting next year. So there will be over 130 episodes by the end of the year of lunchtime listening. So if you want to have access to the other episodes and all the activities, you can get into contact with me. And if you'd like to study with me, you have until Sunday. On Sunday, I will be closing the spaces on my dynamic course. So if you're interested in studying with me, send me a message on WhatsApp. The link is in my bio here on Instagram, and we can chat about what's best for you guys. So thank you very much for coming, guys, to class today. Have a lovely weekend, And how about listening to some wonderful music by Ozzy Osbourne to remember what a great artist he was. And I'm sure he is looking down and listening to everybody enjoying his music. What a great legacy to have left. Thank you very much, guys, and I'll see you all very soon.